All right, welcome to our reading lecture for week 5, English 101, Rhetoric 1. Our rhetoric and writing lecture was kind of long. I apologize this week. So I'm going to keep this reading one short, under 10 minutes, and I will get started. We're going to talk about two things. A temporary matter, which is the next story we're going to be reading. So don't be confused, hopefully. To get through all of our readings, including our journal readings and everything, we have to stay just a little bit ahead of what we're writing about. So right now we're writing about Edison, New Jersey still, but we're going to start into a new story, which I'll talk about in just a minute. All right, so the story we're going to talk about is called Temporary Matter. And just like we've done before with other stories, I want to start out by thinking about our two main characters. And you can see a picture here. This is not, I think this is from a movie, like an amateur kind of movie version of this short story by Jhumpa Lahiri called A Temporary Matter. But our two main characters, Shobha and Shukumar, we're going to talk about them. They're a married couple who are going through a kind of a period in their life that's very difficult, and we're not sure how it's all going to turn out. But those are our two most important characters. There's a few other characters that come up, but they're going to be the focus. Let's look at this just a little bit to talk about Shobha and Shukumar and get us into the story. And then again, you can read the story and then you'll be able to comment hopefully in the journal as well. The notice informed them that it was a temporary matter. This is the very beginning of the story. For 5 days, their electricity would be cut off for 1 hour, beginning at 8 p.m. A line had gone down in the last snowstorm, and the repairmen were going to take advantage of the milder evenings to set it right. The work would affect only the houses on the quiet, tree-lined street, within walking distance of a row of brick-faced stores and a trolley stop where Shobha and Shukumar had lived for 3 years. "It's good of them to warn us," Shobha conceded after reading the notice aloud, more for her own benefit than Shukumar's. She let the strap of her leather satchel, plump with files, slip from her shoulders and left it in the hallway as she walked into the kitchen. She wore a navy blue poplin raincoat over gray sweatpants and white sneakers, looking at 33 like the type of woman she'd once claimed she would never resemble. Okay, so there we have the kind of setup for the story and our two characters. You get the idea. This temporary matter, now this could be a symbol too. You remember the story Hills Like White Elephants, where there was the knocking on the door and then they wouldn't let them in? Maybe in some ways, Jhumpa Lahiri here in her story is doing some kind of forecasting or kind of hinting about what might go on in the story. With this first paragraph, the idea of a temporary matter. You could say lots of things are temporary in life, right? Life itself is temporary, so I don't want to get too philosophical here too early. But this story has a lot of, I think, under the surface, just like all the stories. You know, literature tends to be more like that, and I would say all the stories we've been looking at are what I would call literary stories, and they tend to be a little more, not that genre stories or more entertaining stories can't have this depth, but there's a lot of depth. There's a lot going on under the surface. Remember the iceberg method that Hemingway supposedly employed? Maybe a lot of writers do that. So we're going to have these two characters set up. There's going to be this power outage every night at 8 p.m. Boom, they're going to be stuck without, and this is before our phones. This story is in the 90s. I think it takes place in the 90s also. So I think some people had phones, but they certainly weren't really smartphones. They couldn't do much like they can now. So if the power goes off, your computer's off, your TV's off, radio, everything. So you're going to be forced to come into contact maybe. And that's a big part of what's going on in this story, as you'll see as you get into it. Where and when does the story take place? So here we know we had a power outage and there was a snowstorm. I don't know if it's mentioned yet. You can see if you can figure out that they did mention the street. We know it's a city because there's a trolley stop. I mean, mostly in the U.S., only larger cities have public transportation. I don't think it really tells us yet, but we know it's somewhere probably north too, because they have snow like regularly, and it's enough that it knocked down the power lines and they have to repair those. We also might know that it's somewhat getting toward the end of winter, because they said the milder temperatures now would give them a chance to fix, things have kind of thawed out a little bit, sounds like. And you'll see more of that as you get into the story. So yeah, Boston. It's Boston. I think I don't know if that comes up exactly in the story, but during this recurring power outage, that's our setting. Here's another just little excerpt from the early part of the story. A sheaf of mail on the table without a glance. Her eyes were still fixed on the notice in her other hand. So here we have this notice that they're going to turn off the power every night. "When I'm here, you mean," Shukumar said. He put a glass lid on a pot of lamb, adjusting it so only the slightest bit of steam could escape. Since January, he'd been working at home, trying to complete the final chapters of his dissertation on agrarian revolts in India. When do the repairs start? So he's a graduate student, right? He's working on a PhD. His wife's working. He's been at home most of the time working on his PhD since January. It says March 19th. So now we know we're in March probably. This is coming up soon. Is today the 19th? Shoba walked over to the framed corkboard that hung on the wall by the fridge, bare except for a calendar of William Morris wallpaper pattern. She looked at it as if for the first time, studying the wallpaper pattern carefully on the top half before allowing her eyes to fall to the numbered grid on the bottom. A friend had sent the calendar in the mail as a Christmas gift, even though Shoba and Shukumar hadn't celebrated Christmas that year. So it seems like they normally would celebrate Christmas, but something has happened and they weren't really in the mood to celebrate anything. Today then, Shoba announced, you have a dentist appointment next Friday, by the way. Okay, so we got the setup here. We kind of know when and where. Another thing I want you to look for as you read through this story the first time is the language, the abstract, kind of concrete, but literal, figurative. If you see metaphors, if you think you see symbols of things, or if it's just pretty straightforward language as you read. And then again, the point of view, we talked about this before, is it being told first person? Is it Shoba or Shukumar saying, oh, I did this and he did this? Or is it this kind of narrator who's outside of them and kind of looking down on both of them and who knows everything that's going on? And that would be like a third person telling the story. And then are there universal themes? Things that, everybody might, or most people might be able to relate to, like children and family and success and motivation and working hard and maybe relationship difficulties and things like that. So there might be some of these universal ideas and themes in the story that come up. All right, so our reading summaries for week 5. If you want to read the whole story, that's great. But if you want to, at least for this first week, try to get through the first 10 pages of the story. It's a longer one. We're getting into longer stories, and probably the last story we read will be the longest if we get to that. We'll see how everything goes as the semester progresses. But this one's a little longer, a little bit more to chew on. So if you want to just look at those first 10 pages, or you can read the whole story, that's up to you. And then finally, for our journals, remember, journals are not due until the end of the semester, but I do highly recommend that you just start them because it could be overwhelming at the end of the semester if you haven't done any of them. This one's about prenatal care, and obviously as you read the story with Shoba and Shukumar, I think you'll see how this ties into our topic of the short story, because the short story has a lot to do with issues around not so much whether she got prenatal care or not, but how difficult it can be for an expectant mother and the whole family when there's any kind of difficulty or problem with the pregnancy, which of course, if you don't have good prenatal care, it would be really hard to deal with any kinds of issues or problems that could come up, whether it's premature birth or just different difficulties the mother can have. So take a look at this. This is for your journal for week 5. And it talks again about this idea of the U.S. actually has a pretty high infant mortality, in other words, and maternal mortality, in other words, mothers or children who die during childbirth. And compared to other developed countries, the U.S. has a pretty high rate. And so you can look at that and learn more about that in the article Prenatal Care for this week. And again, that's going to tie into our essay, our reading, A Temporary Matter, which is then going to be the springboard for essay 5 and 6 later on in the semester. So we're a little ahead on the readings, and that's okay because we're gonna be coming back to these later. Don't worry, they'll all tie in as we get into the semester more. All right, well, I told you I'd keep it fairly brief, so that's 8:50. I will go ahead and stop the presentation now, and if you have any questions, please send me an email, and if not, I will see you either in class or in office hours if you need my help.